All right, so you've probably been hearing this term de-dollarization everywhere lately, and I bet you're wondering, what's the big deal?
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
It is, and we've got a whole stack of reports and analyses here that we're going to try to unpack for you today.
We're going to take a deep dive into it.
Exactly, a deep dive into de-dollarization, which basically means
Moving away from...
yeah, moving away from using the U.S. dollar for global trade and finance.
Exactly.
But what's really interesting is that this isn't just some theoretical thing.
Right. It's happening right now.
It's happening as we speak.
Yeah.
And some of the countries that are leading the charge might surprise you.
Yeah, for instance, one of the biggest stories recently is this agreement between Iran and Russia to completely ditch the U.S. dollar.
Whoa, hold on. Dropping the dollar like completely for trade between two major countries like Iran and Russia.
Yeah.
That's got to have some pretty big implications.
It definitely does. And it's a really significant move, especially because both of these countries are under heavy sanctions from the West.
Oh, right.
So this move is partly out of necessity. You know, they're trying to find ways to work around those sanctions, but it's also a pretty clear message.
Like a power move.
Yeah, you could say it, a way of kind of pushing back against the dominance of the U.S.
So how are they actually doing this? I mean, trading without using the dollar, which is like the most widely used currency in the world.
Yeah, how do you even do that?
Yeah, it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Well, they've set up some really interesting mechanisms. For example, back in July 2024, their central banks signed what's called a currency swap agreement.
Currency swap agreement.
Yeah, essentially it's a way for them to directly exchange their currencies, so the ruble and the ruble at a fixed rate, so they don't have to use the dollar as a middleman.
So let me see if I understand this correctly. So like a Russian company that wants to buy oil from Iran would just pay in rubles.
Right.
And an Iranian company that wants to buy, let's say, wheat from Russia would pay in reals.
Exactly.
And that's it.
That's it. They've completely cut out the dollar from those transactions.
Wow, that's a huge change from how things usually work.
And they haven't stopped there. They've also adopted this thing called the mirror payment system.
Mir.
Yeah, mirror. It's basically Russia's alternative to SWIFT.
SWIFT, now remind me what SWIFT is again.
Oh, sure. Yeah, SWIFT is that network that handles most international financial transactions.
Oh, yeah, okay. So it's like the plumbing of the global financial system.
Exactly. So by cutting out SWIFT, they're making a really strong statement.
What kind of statement?
Well, it shows that they're serious about building a financial system that's independent of the U.S.
It's like they're creating their own little financial universe.
Yeah, and you know what? I even read that there are ATMs in Russia now that dispense Iranian rubles.
Wow, really?
Yeah, so it's not just theoretical anymore. These changes are actually happening on the ground.
That's wild. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to see how this is all playing out in such tangible ways.
It really is. And you know what? The Iran-Russia situation is just one example of a broader trend that's happening globally.
So you're saying that other countries are also starting to think about ditching the dollar?
Exactly. De-dollarization is gaining momentum. And there are all sorts of reasons why countries might want to do this.
Okay, so tell me more about this. What are some of the motivations behind de-dollarization?
Well, for starters, there's China. They've been really pushing the use of their own currency, the yuan, for international transactions.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
They've even set up their own version of SWIFT.
They have?
Yeah, it's called CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System.
CIPS, okay.
And it's already processing trillions of dollars worth of transactions each year.
Trillions. That's a lot of money. It sounds like they're really serious about this.
They are. And then there's India. They're also looking for ways to reduce their reliance on the dollar.
So how are they doing that?
Well, for example, they've started settling some of their oil imports from Russia using rupees, which is their own currency.
Okay, so they're kind of doing their own thing too.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this group of countries called BRICS.
BRICS. I've heard that term, but I'm not entirely sure who they are.
Okay, so BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Okay, big players.
Yeah, they're a group of major emerging economies, and they've been getting more and more vocal about wanting to create a new global financial order.
And what would that look like?
Well, one of their goals is to reduce dependence on the U.S. dollar.
So they're on board with this whole de-dollarization thing.
They're actually working on setting up their own development bank and a reserve currency pool as alternatives to the existing systems, which are all very dollar-centric.
So it sounds like there's a real appetite out there for finding alternatives to the dollar.
Yeah, there is. And it's not just about sanctions or politics. There are other reasons, too.
Like what?
Well, some countries are concerned about the volatility of the U.S. economy, and they want to protect themselves from that.
Okay, that makes sense.
And others see it as a way to strengthen regional ties and promote the use of their own currencies.
So it's about having more control over their own economic destinies.
Exactly. And of course, there's also an element of wanting to push back against U.S. influence on the global stage.
So it's like a quiet economic rebellion brewing.
Maybe you could call it that.
But let's be realistic here for a second. Is the U.S. dollar really in danger? I mean, it still seems like the king of the global financial system.
That's true. It's still the dominant currency by far. Something like 88.4% of all foreign exchange transactions still involve the U.S. dollar.
88.4%.
And 59% of global reserves, which are basically the foreign currency assets held by central banks, are held in dollars.
Wow, that's a huge chunk of the global financial pie. So is all this talk about de-dollarization just hype then?
Well, it's not that simple. I mean, while the dollar is still very strong, de-dollarization does present some real challenges.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is the sheer amount of infrastructure that's needed to support alternative systems.
Like what kind of infrastructure?
Well, think about it, creating something like the mirror payment system or a new reserve currency that's going to take a ton of coordination and investment.
Yeah, that's not going to happen overnight.
Exactly. And getting everyone on board is a huge challenge, especially on a global scale.
I mean, even if it takes time, it sounds like this shift away from the dollar could have some real consequences for the U.S. economy, right? Should we be worried?
Well, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. If the demand for the dollar starts to drop, that could set off a chain reaction.
Like what kind of chain reaction?
Well, for one thing, a weaker dollar could make imported goods more expensive, which could lead to inflation.
Okay, so that's not good.
No.
I guess the dollar's still pretty strong overall, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the fact that oil is traded in dollars gives it a lot of staying power, and the Federal Reserve also has a lot of influence.
Okay, so maybe we don't need to panic just yet, but this whole de-dollarization thing does raise a pretty big question. Could the U.S. dollar actually lose its status as the world's leading reserve currency?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and honestly, it's tough to say. I mean, a sudden collapse is unlikely in the near future.
Okay, so we're not going to see the dollar disappear overnight.
No, but the trend is worth watching. If this de-dollarization thing keeps gaining momentum, we could end up with a multipolar financial world.
Multipolar.
Yeah, where you have several different currencies competing for dominance.
Instead of just the dollar calling all the shots.
Exactly. It would be a pretty fundamental shift in the global economic landscape.
So instead of like a sudden collapse, we're talking about a gradual evolution.
More like a slow burn.
Okay, but what would a multipolar financial world actually look like? I mean, how would it affect everyday people like us?
Well, for starters, it would probably lead to more competition and maybe even more instability in currency markets.
So more ups and downs.
Yeah, you might see more dramatic fluctuations in exchange rates as different currencies gain and lose value.
So like imagine planning a trip abroad. Instead of just figuring out how many euros or yen you'd need for your dollars, you'd have to keep track of a whole bunch of different currencies.
Yeah, and who knows what those exchange rates would be.
It sounds complicated.
It would definitely be more complex. And what about online shopping? Would we have to worry about currency conversions every time we buy something from overseas? It's possible. I mean, we might see more businesses accepting payments in a wider variety of currencies, or maybe even the emergence of new digital currencies that are specifically designed for cross-border transactions.
So lots of potential changes.
Yeah, predicting the exact outcome is really tough, but it definitely points to a more complex financial environment.
I mean, change can be scary, but it's not always a bad thing. Are there any potential benefits to this shift away from the dollar, or is it just a recipe for chaos?
Well, I think there are some potential upsides. For example, it could reduce the ability of any single country to use its currency as a political or economic weapon.
Like we see with sanctions.
Exactly. So it could lead to a more level playing field, in a sense.
Less economic bullying on a global scale.
Yeah, you could say that. And it could also encourage stronger regional cooperation and trade relationships.
How?
Well, we might see the formation of regional currency blocks where countries within a specific geographic area primarily use their own currencies for trade and investment.
Kind of like what they have in Europe with the euro.
Yeah, exactly. The Eurozone is a good example of how countries can pool their resources and create a shared currency system.
Okay, that makes sense. But this is all still pretty hypothetical, right? We don't actually have a multipolar financial world just yet. So how can we even begin to understand what it would look like?
That's a good point. It's a process that's still unfolding, but we can look to history for some clues.
Okay, so what does history tell us?
Well, if you look back at the period before World War I, for example, you see a multipolar world with several major currencies competing for influence.
Interesting. And how did that work out? Was it a good thing overall?
It was a mixed bag, to be honest. There was definitely more competition, but also more instability.
Oh.
And ultimately, the system collapsed, which contributed in part to the outbreak of war.
Well, that's not very reassuring.
No, it's not. But I think it serves as a reminder that any major shift in the global financial order is likely to be pretty turbulent.
So we should expect some bumps along the way.
Most likely, there will be winners and losers, and it's really hard to say what the long-term outcomes will be.
So we just have to wait and see how it all plays out.
Pretty much.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, that the dollar does lose its dominance. What would replace it? Would it be another single currency, or would we see something more fragmented?
That's a great question, and there's no easy answer. I mean, some experts believe that the Chinese yuan is well positioned to become a major global currency.
That makes sense, given China's economic power.
Yeah, but would other countries be comfortable with that? I mean, would they really want to trade one dominant currency for another?
I guess that's a valid concern.
Yeah, a lot of countries might be hesitant to become too reliant on the yuan.
So maybe a more likely scenario is a system with multiple major currencies operating alongside each other.
Yeah, kind of like a global currency basket.
Maybe with the yuan, the euro, and some new digital currencies thrown in the mix.
Exactly. It could lead to a more balanced system, but it would also be a lot more complex to manage.
This is all getting pretty complicated.
It is. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
But it's also pretty important, right? I mean, this is about the future of money.
Yeah, the evolution of the global financial system is going to have huge implications for all of us. It affects everything from international trade and investment to personal travel and even how we think about money itself.
So we need to pay attention to how this all unfolds.
Definitely.
Okay. So as we watch this transition play out, what are some of the key things we should be looking for?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to watch how central banks around the world are responding to these changes.
Because they're the ones who manage currencies, right?
Exactly, and they're responsible for keeping the financial system stable.
So what the Federal Reserve does here in the U.S. will be especially important.
Absolutely. The Fed's decisions on interest rates and other monetary policies are going to have a ripple effect throughout the global economy.
And what about other major central banks, like the European Central Bank or the People's Bank of China?
They'll be key players, too. We're likely to see more coordination and cooperation between central banks as they try to figure out how to navigate this new landscape.
So it's like a global game of strategy where everyone's trying to figure out the rules as they go along.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that's a good analogy. It's a very dynamic and evolving situation with a ton of variables at play.
It's definitely a lot to think about. I mean, when you really start to consider how these global financial forces can actually impact our everyday lives, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. It's like this whole hidden world that's operating behind the scenes.
Exactly. So before we wrap up our deep dive into de-dollarization, is there like one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
That's a good question. I think the main thing to remember is that the U.S. dollar's dominance, while still very powerful, might not be quite as unassailable as it once seemed.
So you're saying that the dollar's reign could be coming to an end?
Well, not necessarily an end, but maybe a shift. You know, like a change in its status. The world is changing and the global financial system is changing along with it.
So even if the dollar doesn't completely disappear, its total dominance might become a thing of the past.
Exactly. We could be moving towards a world where multiple currencies play a major role, which would create a more multipolar financial landscape and probably a more volatile one, too.
That's a pretty significant shift to contemplate. We've talked about some of the potential challenges, but are there any potential opportunities that might arise from this transition?
Oh, absolutely. I think one really interesting possibility is that it could lead to a surge in financial innovation.
Like what kind of innovation?
Well, we're already seeing this with the rise of digital currencies and new payment systems. A more competitive environment could really accelerate these kinds of advancements.
So it's like a forcing function.
Exactly. It could push the financial sector to become more efficient, more accessible, more innovative.
So this shift could actually benefit consumers in the long run.
Yeah, potentially it could lead to lower costs, more choices, and greater financial inclusion, especially for people in developing countries who haven't always had equal access to the global financial system.
That's definitely a more positive way to look at it, but it sounds like there's still a lot of uncertainty about how this will all play out.
Oh, for sure. We're in uncharted territory here, and the path forward is definitely not clear-cut, but that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
It's like watching history unfold in real time.
Exactly. We're witnessing a truly historic transformation, and the implications are huge.
And I'll be watching closely to see how this all develops. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure, anytime.
And for those of you listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this whole de-dollarization thing. What do you think the future holds for the U.S. dollar and the global financial system? Head over to our website or social media and share your insights with us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.